On a December night in 1431, this Transylvania fortress town saw the birth of one of the most terrifying figures in history. He was christened Dracula, and he unleashed a reign of terror on the country we now call Romania. His name became a byword for cruelty. Hundreds of years later, his exploits inspired the greatest horror story of our age, that of Count Dracula, the blood-drinking vampire. The real Dracula died in battle in 1476. This is the story of an American family who for generations have lived in his shadow. They are related to him by marriage and are the direct descendants of his most bitter enemy, Vintila Florescu. Over the years, their investigations into Dracula resulted in misfortune, fear, and tragedy. At times, it even seemed like they were the victims of some kind of curse. Now, to confront these memories, they have returned to Romania to trace their family history back to its violent beginnings and revisit those places where their ancestors met Dracula face to face. Their journey provides us with a unique insight into the man and the myth that was Dracula.
This is the elegant street of Bucharest, where each person tried to have a house that is more ambitious than the other, and the styles varied enormously.
These are the direct descendants of the family who crossed swords with Dracula.
Dad, isn't this where your house, where you were born, right? Right here.
This is the house where I lived as a young child with my aunt. I used to play tennis there.
Historian Radu Florescu is the man who revealed the real Dracula to the world in a historical bestseller published in 1972. But the family connection with Dracula goes back much further. His ancestor, Vintila Florescu, led a revolt against Dracula. More recently, his uncle George was the man who discovered Dracula's tomb, and in the previous generation, Dmitri Florescu spent years hunting the missing portrait of Dracula. Today, Radu Florescu and his son John want to trace their connection to Dracula back to its origins. This has brought them to the Patriarch's palace in Bucharest. The Patriarch of Romania is the head of the country's Orthodox Church. The Florescus are here to tell him about their plans. In particular, they want to find a remote and run-down monastery where they believe their earliest ancestors are buried. The Patriarch blesses their mission, a big help in gaining access and cooperation. And there is another place the Florescus have to visit. Radu spent 15 years tracking down the real Dracula. And during that time, one particular place came to dominate his research. The castle that Dracula built in the Transylvanian Alps at Poianar. It is a castle that Radu Florescu refuses to enter again. It was here that his uncle George Florescu fell and later died from his injuries, and here that his son John spent the most terrifying night of his life. The castle was built in 1457 by prisoners captured in battle. Those unfit for labor were impaled on wooden stakes. From then on, Dracula was known as Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler. But all his proclamations used the name he had been given at birth, Dracula, signed in blood-red letters.
It means son of the dragon, because his father had been invested in the Order of the Dragon, whose mission was to conduct crusades against the Protestant heretics and mostly against the Turks.
As to what Dracula looked like, there is little evidence. His grandfather and uncle, princes before him, stare down from the walls of this remote monastery, their names in Greek beside them. But for Dracula, we have only this portrait and this description by the papal legate to Hungary, who met him face to face in 1464. He was not very tall, but very stocky and strong, with a cold and terrible appearance. Very long eyelashes framed large, wide-open green eyes. The bushy black eyebrows made them appear threatening. In the 15th century, Romania was divided into many small kingdoms, organized along military lines, and each with its own fortified churches and castles. It was a rich land with busy trading centers like the walled city of Brasov, and a tempting target for the Muslim Turks who were trying to invade Europe from the east. Dracula swiftly became the greatest block to their ambitions.
He represented in the 15th century a vivid symbol of the fight against the Turkish invasion. If you prefer, a kind of crusader defending the Christendom against Muslims. And in such a way, he became a kind of modern hero in art, in literature. I must confess, for me, he is a hero.
But this crusader had a darker side. In Romanian, Dracula means not just the dragon, but the devil. In religious art, when St. George slew the dragon, he was also slaying the devil. And to his enemies, Vlad Tepes was a devil. His capital, Târgoviște, was the scene of his greatest atrocity. As a Turkish army advanced on the city, they were brought to a halt by the sight of thousands of captives, whom Vlad had skewered on wooden stakes, turning the valley floor into a forest of the impaled. German pamphleteers claimed that he liked to dine among the festering corpses and drank their blood. And that once, when a nobleman complained about the smell, Vlad impaled him on a very long stake, saying, "You live up there, where the stench cannot reach you."
He did what he had to do in his period of time. He tried to put a little bit of order in his country, which is nothing to blame. The punishments he provided for his enemies were not very unusual for that times.
Vlad was a great monarch, strong and cruel, it's true, but a very good one. And don't forget, Vlad Tepes lived in the same age, in the same century with the famous English king, Richard III.
Richard III has gone down in history as a murderer. But like Vlad, the worst stories about him were written by his rivals. These pictures were drawn by his enemies, German invaders. Many believe the legend of the blood-drinking Dracula probably has its origins in these images, rather than in hard fact. And so his terrifying reputation spread. Such is the story of how, when Genoese ambassadors refused to remove their caps, Dracula nailed them to their heads. But as a key defender of Christian lands against the Muslim invaders, he had the support of the church. And there were the romantic tales of night attacks and close escapes. Most famous of all was the story of how Dracula's young wife faced a Turkish attack on Castle Dracula. Fearing that there was no escape, she raced through the castle and onto the battlements, from which she flung herself into the valley below. But Dracula had already made good his escape along a secret passageway, and then rode off on a horse, which had its shoes nailed on backwards to trick his pursuers. But in the winter of 1476, he finally met his end, at the hands of his Turkish enemies. His head was cut off, taken back to Constantinople, and impaled on a stake. He was 45. But Dracula's death birthed a legend that would sweep through Europe. The chilling tale of his bloody rule would be reinforced by the folk beliefs of the Carpathian villagers. In the buried body that did not decay and became the undead, the vampire, Vlad the Impaler would become Count Dracula, the blood-drinking demon who could not die. And over the centuries, the Florescus would also find themselves caught up in his menacing and violent story. The Florescus were part of the tiny circle of wealthy nobles known as boyars. Vintila Florescu arranged a marriage between his sister Maria and Dracula's half-brother, Vlad the Monk, and then supported his attempt to overthrow Dracula and become prince himself. But the uprising failed, and both Vlad the Monk and Florescu were forced to flee. The Florescus and Dracula were now bitter enemies.
The Florescus are as old as the country itself. And we are, I think, and I think most of the genealogists agree, the oldest family in Romania.
Wisely, both Vlad the Monk and Maria Florescu retired to a monastic life. Their bloodline finally died out in the 19th century, outlasting Dracula's by 100 years. But the bloodline of Vintila Florescu, Dracula's most hated enemy, ran on for 500 years, to the present day, and Radu, his son John, and grandson Vlad.
The history of the Florescu family is intimately mixed with the Romanian history, is part of it. And on 5 centuries, you find at every epoch, really, one or several members of the family.
But the people of those times left no writings and few portraits. Finding physical evidence of these earliest ancestors would not be easy. But through the church, John has managed to find the monastery, one of the oldest in Romania, where the first Florescus are said to be buried. He visited it with historian Stefan Andrescu. The monastery was being heavily renovated, but behind the scaffolding, things looked promising. Could these faded frescoes be the faces of his medieval family?
So, and this is basically where the stones were laid inside the church. I guess.
Yes, I see the priest.
But the priest tells them that although Florescus are buried here, their tombstones have been removed and their graves covered over with planks.
What he was saying is that this goes back just about to Dracula's time.
Because of the renovations, the stones have been moved to another part of the grounds and stored under a nearby hut. And a lot of muscle power is going to be needed to get them out.
On here, you know, once we get it out.
Okay, that's good. Okay. The last century, it was possible to read.
Okay, so you can see the inscriptions.
Okay.
Okay, put it over there. Okay.
Here is an inscription in Cyrillic alphabetic,
Right.
And in Slavonic language. It means at the beginning there is a cross, and after, here lies Jupan Dragici Florescu, the slave of God, He lived at the end of 15th century and the beginning of 16th century. So he's in the same time with Dracula and Dragic. It was one of the most high official at the princely court. Right.
Dragic was the son of Vintila Florescu, Dracula's bitter rival. This is the oldest Florescu tombstone found to date.
There's the monastery right over there.
Yes.
The three towers. It's how old is it? It's about
Older than Dracula.
When Dracula was killed, his head was believed to have been taken to Constantinople and his body buried on the island monastery of Snagov. During his lifetime, he turned it into a fortress and imprisoned and murdered some of his rivals here. Legend has it that he hid his treasure here by dropping it to the bottom of the lake. And it is here that the fate of the Florescu family once again met that of Dracula. 70 years ago, Radu Florescu's uncle, George, made this same boat journey across the lake.
Okay, what I'll do, Dad, I'll help you. Yeah.
Romanian history was George's passion.
My uncle was an extraordinary man. He was the only gentleman in Bucharest who dressed like a 19th century aristocrat. I could imagine his dress was fashionable in Victorian England. Garters and all, monocle, little medal. He was the director of the History Museum in Bucharest. And he was not a professional historian, but he wrote far better books than almost any professional historian.
According to folklore, Dracula was buried in the monastery, but no one knew where. George Florescu determined to be the first to find the tomb, open it, and look upon Dracula's remains. In the summer of 1931, he began his search at Snagov.
This is one of the most important moments in Uncle George's life. He was waiting for this to uncover the tomb that you see right in front of us, where, according to tradition, Dracula was supposed to lay at rest when the tomb was opened. They found, to their utter amazement, no casket, just the bones of oxen and other animals.
George then searched the rest of the church and found a similar tomb, in a strange place, just inside the doorway.
We suspect when this monastery came in the hands of Greek monks who did not like Dracula and did not want him sitting so close to God, and so the Greek abbot of the time said, let him rest there where the people and the peasants can trample over his unworthy remains.
With the help of a colleague, George managed to lever open the heavy stone lid of the tomb and had only seconds to peer inside before the air and strong sunlight rushed in to destroy the contents.
George told me that when opening the coffin, he saw the whole body intact in the light of a late summer day, and he could see it disintegrating under his eyes. But he saw he was dressed in purple, he had all kinds of jewels.
In those few seconds, George also saw that the face of the corpse was covered by a handkerchief, something Matei Kazaku questioned him about later.
I asked him, did the body had a head? And he said, well, I think, because he had this handkerchief on his face. That means it was a head. And then I said, well, but historically it is known that Dracula was beheaded and his head sent to Istanbul. And George was quite puzzled because this body was not Dracula if he possessed a head. But after years, I discovered that the Turks used to sculpt the heads. They had a brilliant technique to take out the skin, all the skin of the head, with hair and face, and then conserve it with all kind of spices. So Dracula could be buried with a skull without the skin. And that explains the need of a handkerchief, because without the skin on your face, must have been something like dreadful.
Shortly after Dracula's burial, a terrible storm destroyed the adjoining chapel, which fell into the lake. Locals still claim they can hear the bells tolling beneath the waves. But the great oak doors of Snagoff Chapel floated on the water to a nearby village. They survive today, one of the great artistic wonders of the age of Dracula. George Florescu had fulfilled a dream and gazed upon the corpse of Dracula. But this merely stimulated him to further research. Above all, he wanted to locate and visit Vlad the Impaler's long-forgotten mountain fortress. His quest would lead to Dracula's castle and frightening events that some would claim were the curse of Dracula. All that remains of Dracula's castle are these ruined battlements on a mountaintop. Yet when George Florescu had the chance to visit it in 1969, along with Radu, his son John, and some friends, he saw it as the culmination of a life's work.
He decided he would like to go to the castle. I think he just liked the idea of this detective hunt. At that time, Castle Dracula was not yet well recognized by anyone. It was an abandoned old thing that no one knew much about. And we climbed up along a winding path which led all the way up.
The Florescus were accompanied by Romanian Dracula researcher Matei Kazaku.
I said, like a joke, but when Vlad built this castle, it was like a kind of curse against his enemies, never to climb into it, never to come alive to the castle. Maybe you, as a descendant of this noble family, you were under the curse. And he was very afraid, because he was a very religious man, George Florescu.
The younger members of the family led the ascent up the mountain. Then, within sight of the summit, George slipped and fell down the mountainside. He was carried down to a local hospital, but died some months later.
So we all said, well, this must be Dracula's curse. There were several things everybody will tell you. Each of us had his accidents, his incidents, his moments of pain, of fear.
Radu was deeply unsettled by these events and convinced that all was not what it seemed at the castle. He returned a few months later, in the winter of 1969, to carry out a proper investigation, in the company of young filmmaker Myron Yora.
It was cold, cold, cold. In fact, in the Russian car, which was given to the camera team, there was no heater, and instead we had furs in the back seat. My impression at the time was that we were in the presence of a great deal of power. Not necessarily good or evil, but that this was an extraordinary place. Down in the village below, the birds were twittering away, and there was a great deal of ambient noise. Arriving in the vicinity of the castle, as you can hear right now, there is complete silence. Not the sound of a bird, not the sound of a dog barking, nothing.
During filming on that first trip, Myron doubled over with stomach pains. He was rushed to a hospital and then flown home to Boston, where he was diagnosed with internal bleeding.
I was taken to the Mass General Hospital, and I had some internal bleeding, which eventually cleared up. There was no clear diagnosis.
As soon as he was released, he took his film to be developed. But within hours, the lab called to say the film was damaged.
Some of the footage was fine. The rest of the footage, mostly the Transylvania footage of the castle, had a milky quality to it. Something had interfered with the film, and we never really had a definitive answer.
Now Radu has returned to Castle Dracula, but has no desire to revisit the ramparts.
Going up the castle was perhaps the most frightening thing I experienced. There was something eerie at that sight. I have headaches suddenly. I don't put garlics or courses in my pocket, but I have a certain reluctance to go there, and I cannot explain it to you rationally.
Back in 1972, the death of his great-uncle George and his own father's misfortunes convinced John Florescu that there was some malevolent force at work in the castle. Together with school friend Steve Keefe, he decided to spend a night at the castle. Now, 30 years later, he and Steve are back to meet up with old memories.
You know, it was around here where my father called. His Uncle George had fallen. He'd fallen down there. And he yelled to me to come. And I went down. So Uncle George never made it, even though he was 4/5 the way here.
We chose the date of July 14th, 1972, because we wanted to have a full moon so we could see what was going on. We rigged up the castle with lights.
Tape recorder and camera and with flash, and thinking that we may actually see something paranormal that might back up that there was something unusual about this castle.
We laid out our sleeping bags, and we decided to alternate, one up, one sleeping, one up, one sleeping. We were actually sleeping in that tower right there, and we are looking out toward the plains. But a little past midnight, we saw a beam from a fixed source of light, as if it was being pulled by a cable. I said, you know, there's something here.
At first we thought it was local people perhaps carrying a lantern to check on us. But as it approached and got closer, we realized it was a reddish color, and we began to become a little bit more afraid.
I yelled to it in Romanian, you know, who are you, what are you? And just when the light got into the clearing, the light went out.
We came with the expectation that something could happen. But when something did happen, we were quite overcome with the fear, and this is what we didn't really expect, to the point where when we left in the morning, we were glad to leave and felt that we had witnessed something of a paranormal experience.
I believe a sense of evil lingers around Castle Dracula. Too many dramas unfolded there, too many crimes, too many dark scenes took place there. So I felt something evil.
Over the years, the story of Dracula's rule was reinforced by local superstition. Transylvania was home to those who believed in vampires. In 1897, an Irishman named Bram Stoker would immortalize the memory of Dracula and the myth of the vampire to spectacular effect. Much of the evil we associate with the name of Dracula as a blood-sucking vampire is due to the character created by Bram Stoker in his 19th century bestseller.
For young people today, Bram Stoker's Dracula is the most important than Vlad Tepes. It's pity that history is not preferred to such a legend, but it's true.
Stoker's creation was in fact an amalgam of the folk memory of Dracula and the very real beliefs of the farmers and mountain people of Romania. They believed in the existence of what they called the undead. These were people who had been buried, but whose bodies did not decay. According to this belief, such people became vampires and would rise from their graves at night to attack the living. Sometimes only a fine line separated these beliefs from church ritual. Matei Kazaku's father was an Orthodox priest.
In the Romanian Orthodox Church, there is a custom to unearth the dead after 3 years, maximum after 7 years. And this is a very old custom. It is known from the Middle Ages. And the idea was to see, to confirm that the corpse was totally rotten. That is, in the mentality of the church and of the people, that the soul and the body were separated. People believed doing that can help the dead for the last judgment. The soul was in the sky or in purgatorium or somewhere else, and the body could return to the earth. And so my father was asked by people to do this ceremony. So they went to the cemetery. The coffin was dug out, and then the bones were taken out. They were washed with a special oil, put in a clean linen sheet, and buried again. There is a definite parallel between this belief and the beliefs in the vampires. That is, the dead are undead.
Even today, traditions concerning the burial of the dead echo these beliefs. A dead man will be at risk of becoming a vampire if he leaves the house feet first. For those who catch his gaze as he is carried out, will follow him to the grave. Or if a cat or dog crosses his path on the way to the cemetery, then he may join the ranks of the undead.
In general, country folk avoid talking about vampires because they signify evil, and that leads to fear. But there have been other cases when an entire village has talked about the vampires with such conviction that the researchers themselves were convinced and frightened. And at night, they hung garlic at the windows and door to protect themselves.
It's true. In some mountainous, remote areas, the funeral beliefs are present with some supernatural beings, and some old customs survived. But they are not vampires. They are connected to ceremonies, to burials, to marriage, to birth, and so on.
One of these old customs provides an eerie parallel to the tradition of the blood-drinking vampire.
There is a long list of ways to protect against the vampire, but these things are extremely rare nowadays. You may still come across such things in some out-of-the-way places. In some remote villages, the dead person would be dug up, the heart of the vampire would be removed, and then boiled and dissolved in wine. And people believed to have been infected by the vampire would have to drink it. There used to be people in certain villages who would be specially paid to carry out this operation?
People do believe in vampires in Romania. My grandfather died in 1947, and in 1983, when my own father died, he was buried in the same tomb. And I wasn't present. My brother, who lives in Bucharest, was there. And he told me he had a terrible shock when seeing his grandfather, whom he had seen in 1947 as a young boy, buried, appear perfectly, in a perfect state of conservation, you know. Then it decayed, it was rotten in some minutes. But in the 17th century, he would have been considered a vampire.
Bram Stoker fused the memory of Vlad the Impaler with Romanian folk traditions. Such was his success that for much of the 20th century, the real Dracula became lost amid myths of vampires and the undead. It would not be until the 1960s that he would find an unlikely rescuer. Nicolae Ceausescu, Romanian president and head of one of Eastern Europe's most repressive regimes, would turn him into a national hero. Most of Radu Florescu's early research was carried out under the gaze of Nicolae Ceausescu's ruthless regime. Romania was now a police state, and Ceausescu was determined that his legacy would be that of Romania's heroic leader in the mold of Vlad the Impaler. Ceausescu's newfound interest in Dracula meant research was a risky business, with heavy political overtones. Radu and his colleagues were making quiet and steady progress until their work was revealed to the wider world during a visit by U.S. President Richard Nixon.
Our embassy was short of staff, so here ambassador gave me the task of being a kind of go-between man for the press corps. There were about, I don't know, 200 American journalists at that time. One journalist asked me, "What are you doing here, Professor Florescu?" And I said, "I'm researching Dracula." And that was the explosion. Suddenly, headlines all over Europe, all over the US. We were scared stiff. I mean, we had not even begun writing a single line. And you know, scholars don't write that fast. A journalist can do the job much quicker.
With a slip of the tongue, the Dracula hunters found themselves the hunted.
The cultural attaché came to us and said that our apartment was bugged. And would we want to have it debugged? He said it was unconscionable for a scholar to be watched like that. And I refused the help he offered. I said it would make them all the more suspicious. I was not doing anything. I was not spying for the CIA. I was just a scholar doing research at that time on Dracula. So he did not come, and the bug stayed in. We knew that the lady at the gate of the apartment, that she would make a report to the Securitate. And at the end of my stay, I said, "Maria, are you a member of the security?" And she said, "Puțin," which means a little.
1976 was the 500th anniversary of Dracula's death, and Ceausescu decided to use the occasion as a way of linking himself with his national hero. He demanded that Vlad's face appear on a special issue of postage stamps. And in a surprising move, even commissioned political dissident Matei Cazacu to write a popular history of his hero.
I was lucky because Ceausescu was interested in history, started to interest himself in the Romanian history, and he needed strong heroes. That was for me beneficial, the fact that Ceausescu and the Romanian authorities thought that Vlad, Dracula, the Impaler, could be a national asset for tourism and, well, for the image of Romania. So I was protected, so to say, by Dracula.
But strangest of all was the way in which Dracula's life was reflected in Ceausescu's final hours. All over Eastern Europe in 1989, popular revolutions toppled the communist regimes. It was only in Romania that things ended in bloodshed. As the end drew near, Ceausescu's heavily loaded helicopter staggered off the roof of his presidential palace. He could have made a bid for freedom in any direction, but instead, he flew to his lakeside residence at Schnagov, where Dracula was buried, and then took off again, only to land at Târgoviște, Dracula's capital. There, where so many had been impaled to die slowly in agony, his death by firing squad was quick.
Well, he finished just like Dracula, like his hero. So I think there is some eternal justice.
Ceausescu was the first to appreciate the potential power of Dracula as a national icon. Today, the legend is central to Romania's tourist industry. The emblem of the Order of the Dragon hangs outside the house where he lived as a young boy, and the town where he was born, the perfect medieval village of Sighișoara, is one of Romania's top tourist destinations. And a huge Dracula theme park is to be built near the hilltop fortress of Rajneș. But Castle Dracula is too inaccessible to be on the tourist trail and lacks the allure of a medieval town. But at long last, the Florescus hope to make their peace with it. The castle has long been a place of fear for the local villagers and the source of supernatural stories. Now, in response to the family's request, the priests from the nearby monastery have come to bless the site. They attempted to climb to the castle the day before, but were driven back by a fierce thunderstorm. Now, instead, they perform their ceremony 1,000 feet below the castle walls, where Dracula's wife plunged to her death over 500 years ago.
In there, that's what the priest was telling us, right?
Yes, yes.
But has revisiting the places where the fate of his family has been entangled with that of Dracula enabled John Florescu to place past events in clearer perspective?
Okay. When I saw those tombstones, I watched as the kids wiped off the dust with those rags.
Here lies as a slave of God.
I thought of these ancestors as individuals. They lived in Dracula's time. They had the courage to fight him. Then, because of the fact that a Florescu married into Dracula's family, that one of my ancestors tried to seize power from Dracula, or we, my father, my great-uncle, or I, we've been too curious, we've had misfortune. This place, there's something to it. There's a darkness about the place. So, am I a little suspicious of it? Yeah. Would I come back and visit it? Yes, I would. Would I spend another night or taunt or play with it? I don't think it's worth it.
In life, Dracula was a champion against Muslim invaders. In legend, he captivated the imagination of a dictator. In storybook fiction, he became a blood-drinking vampire. And his chilling memory inspired a family to hunt for his and their own origins. Meanwhile, today's Romanians have come to terms with Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, Dracula. The merciless tyrant has become Romania's favorite son.